You're listening to Tune Dig, a podcast for music lovers. The premise is simple. In each episode, we dig deep into an album we love, and then we give away a copy to you of that album on vinyl. Go to tunedig.com to see what's up for grabs and learn more about us.
Today we're talking about Love Supreme by John Coltrane. I love to start talking about this record from Coltrane's own narrative because I think it's crucial. I think seeing where he came from to try to write a spiritual opus matters. It doesn't come from wanting to be strange. He would do that on the next two records after this. Mm-hmm. Om sounds like having your brain deconstructed. So to come with one of the most acclaimed jazz albums of all time and have it be about spirituality goes very deep into how he got here.
The most important thing is that this is a fulcrum moment for him. And I would argue it is the singular number one most important jazz record of all time in terms of what it achieves and the combination of what it achieves artistically and the reach that it had, right? Which is the ultimate aim of all good art, to express and to have that expression received by a number of people, an idea, a point, a thing. I mean, this album did huge numbers. I think it sold well over 100,000 copies, so that it's as challenging as it is and that it was commercially successful as it was is really kind of incredible. I mean, it's watershed. There's a once a generation record that pushes people, but also does really well commercially. And you have to talk about this record in contrast to Kind of Blue, which is normally if you're going to start with jazz, just start with this record. I love talking about those two records together. One, just to kind of talk about jazz as an idea, because that's how I started getting into jazz. And that will always be my entry point and so many other people's entry points. But the relationship between those two records epitomizes our musical relationship, I think. I'm very Kind of Blue and you're very A Love Supreme. And we didn't even have to take a BuzzFeed quiz to know that about ourselves. But whereas everything about Kind of Blue is very straightforward, very feel, very pure id, A Love Supreme is more cerebral. It aims to, pun intended, I guess, much higher purpose. They sit really nicely in contrast to one another. And I only want to compare them because they were contemporaries, and I think using one as a mirror to the other helps accentuate each of their finer points. Enough about that. Let's talk about this record and all the reasons that you love it.
Let's not, though. Let's keep talking about it in the context of Kind of Blue.
Okay.
I went to school for music for a little bit. I'm not a professor, so I want to use a little bit of what an actual professor had to say to explain a little bit more about why those two records are similar. Because if we took the BuzzFeed quiz, it would be called, "What kind of modal jazz record are you?" Which means it will never exist, but that's what it would be called. Harvard music scholar described this record as an exemplary recording of what was called modal jazz, or what is called modal jazz. And Kind of Blue is another example of this exact thing. And I think that it's a really important framework with which to view this record, because what we're talking about when we say modal jazz is this idea of using musical modes rather than your traditional chord progression means of creating a song. So some things that comprise modal jazz would be harmonic rhythm that moves really slowly, where you might play over a single chord for a lot, for 4 to 16 measures or even more, right? Which can also create drones, drone type feeling, what's called pedal points. So sustained tones with dissonant harmonies. creating a suppression of traditional chord progressions, literally not doing the thing you would expect to come next on purpose. Harmonies and melodies that are quartal, so in fours, or quintal in fives. There is a fascinating segue you can go down about Coltrane's understanding of fourths and fifths and how it overlapped, I'm serious, with Einstein's theory of relativity in quantum physics. There's a lot of discussion about how some of the ways that Coltrane started mapping out and drawing his understanding of the mathematics of jazz ended up being the same as representations of our universe in physics. If you want to kind of step back and just say, what are we talking about when we talk about modal jazz outside of the ways that we just described it? It's what happens when experts go beyond the fundamentals of understanding something and are able to process it at a level that the rest of us don't get. That's one helpful way to look at Kind of Blue and A Love Supreme together specifically. They were two types of the same way to approach jazz, which moved well beyond the place that 99.9% of even great jazz musicians get to.
If you talk about Coltrane and you ever listen to any of his live stuff, you know there's an urgency and a fervor and all of that to the way that he played. And it was epitomized here, but he was always reaching for a thing, right? And this record is literally about tapping into the cosmic consciousness, God, however somebody may define it, right? But just trying to reach that higher place. And it's a sort of beautiful and literal example of fumbling toward that. Just in the way that he plays is like a fervent, ecstatic, religious quality to it. And when you think about all of his playing, like if you go into the later stuff and it gets aggressive and weird and I mean, truly unlistenable some of the time, like just way too much. When you look at it through that lens, it becomes a little more bearable. Like, what is this guy trying to say about God or the universe or existence or whatever?
That pushing and that urgency that you talked about places A Love Supreme directly on the line of when does jazz become so pretentious that it is unlistenable. Right. And that's not just an opinion you'll develop on your own. That's what jazz scholars have repeatedly referred to this record as. So one of the ways that we can understand how we got here is to understand where he came from, because writing a line of spirituality is exactly writing the line of where this record sits, right? If you have a spirituality that can make sense, on some days there's a million layers of the onion to unfurl and see all the depth of all the things that people have said and thought about an approach to understanding why we're here and what we're doing. On other days, everything that has to do with that spiritual model of the universe is pure pretense, and it doesn't help. In 57, he's playing with Miles Davis. There was nothing greater that you could really aspire to at that particular point. He literally gets fired because he has a heroin and alcohol addiction. He shows up drunk, he's belligerent, and he's apparently done it one too many times, and he literally gets fired from working with Miles Davis.
And it's not like Miles Davis was a disciplinarian, you know, like if Miles Davis is going to be like, hey man, you're one toe over the line.
There are plenty of tropes about it, but jazz was not the clean tuxedo band student side project thing that it is often today.
Right.
Jazz was not appreciated by a good portion of society, and there was legitimate reason for concern in a lot of those cases. When you think about the sheen of the 50s and the things that a lot of the culture tried to pretend where everything was normal, jazz felt like an infestation of just addiction and darkness.
It was dangerous. It makes you physically feel weird. It was the heavy metal of its day, for sure. Let alone the racial component. That added a whole other layer to it.
So to talk about, though, that moment in 57 of him getting fired, you have to understand what was written in the liner notes of this album, which came out in 65. He wrote, "In the year of 1957, I experienced by the grace of God a spiritual awakening, which was to lead me into a richer, fuller, more productive life." He's talking about getting fired from playing with Miles Davis because he was an addict. This was about when you lean into those moments in life that are very hard and really gritty for you, and you don't really want them at the time, and then after the benefit of years and new friendships and working on yourself and building into it and looking back on it and saying, for some reason, I can appreciate that as a moment that I was given instead. This record is a celebration of the realization that that was a moment he was given to do something different and to become the person that he could actually become, at least in this particular context.
And to forgive another pun, it's his christening in a way, like he was mostly unknown for the majority of those early years when his life was kind of chaotic. And the period in which he became known, this record and after, he was astoundingly prolific. He had 10 years of just Ty Segall type output where it was, you almost wanted him to slow down. He put out so much music and performed constantly. And I remember reading a retrospective, and I want to read this quote. By the time he was a major jazz figure, almost his entire life was music. If he wasn't on stage or in a recording studio, he was practicing or studying records. Seemingly every other story of an encounter with Coltrane in the 1960s involved him in a room with a saxophone in his hand playing scales. In his mind, God had saved him and he was going to get back. A love supreme was his expression of gratitude, a hopeful prayer for a better world. So just thinking of somebody who's really devoted to the thing that almost wrecked them, but then also saved them. Just sort of his reverence for the power of music is on full display here. And I think kind of was the framework for his whole deal as a musician from there forward. Honestly,
it's a thing learning about him that has helped me remember when you're recovering from those bad moments. It's not just about, oh God, I got fired from playing with Miles Davis. I had this massive chance and I lost it. I should just be grateful for what I have. That's one approach, but you can actually go back to the place that you were and change things for yourself if you want to, but it takes that level of work to do it.
Right.
We look at him as a genius, and he was, but so many of the geniuses that we know and appreciate are there because they put in the sweat.
To further think about it in a spiritual sense, the more I was reading about Coltrane, the more it seemed like he adopted the practices of a monk. Just a complete devotion to the thing that he knew was going to save his life and his soul. And when you talk about creativity or your craft, I guess broadly defined, if you know a thing can be truly great or the best thing for you, you have to give yourself to it. You can't receive from it unless you give to it in equal measure.
And I think that's another important way to view how this album could happen, because when you go further into Love Supreme over and over again, you find this level of detail that's immense. And it's hard to believe that you could create something this dense, but on top of the individual levels of practice and dedication, we see movies and we watch the montage that glosses over the part, right? You see a few cut scenes, yeah, just running up and down the stairs, right, and somehow you're magically in shape.
And now you can beat a Russian.
That's when you need to push yourself to the test and show us the passage of time. We're gonna need a montage. Ooh, it takes a montage.
And we want to be those people, but we don't truly understand that. I hate the word champions, but we're going to use them here. Champions are people who work harder than you. There's definitely a physicality. I could never be a center in the NBA because I'm like a 5'9", marginally athletic person, and that's fair. But even if I was 6'8", and tremendously athletic, I could still never be an NBA center unless I worked every day of my life to get there, right?
Like that great blues trope, everybody want to go to heaven, but nobody want to die.
And that helps us understand, too, how McCoy Tyner could talk about how this album was a culmination and an extension of their chemistry playing together. So not only was Coltrane learning to understand jazz on a level that surpassed most people, but they also had a chemistry as a group playing together.
And that is such a huge component of this.
And as we'll talk a little bit more about some of the specifics of how Coltrane makes this album so dense, it can't be overstated the way that we're talking about, it's not just getting good at jazz. It's moving into a different level. Like we talked about with modal jazz, to be able to move beyond the common constructs of a song requires you to basically be able to move common musicality into your subconscious.
Right.
So that the thing that you're focusing on is no longer the music itself, but turning the music and twisting it and stretching it